Today, Lynhurst appears intact. The stone still holds its posture. The lawns are trimmed. The silhouette survives. Yet the estate no longer governs anything. It is maintained, but it does not command. What was once an operating system of power now functions as a shell carefully preserved, quietly emptied. Lynhurst was not designed to impress visitors. It was designed to organize influence. Every corridor once reflected a belief that permanence could be built into land, architecture, and routine. Ownership here was not personal expression, it was strategy. The estate absorbed wealth, disciplined it, and returned authority to those who controlled it. That function has ended. What changed was not the building, but the world that made it necessary. The economic logic that justified its scale dissolved. The social order that required its insulation collapsed. What remains is a structure without the pressures that once gave it meaning. This is not a story about a mansion becoming old. It is about an institution losing its reason to exist. Lynhurst did not fall suddenly. It was not destroyed. It was outlived. The estate endured long enough to witness the disappearance of the system it was built to serve. Understanding Lynhurst requires abandoning nostalgia. Its value was never aesthetic, it was operational. To understand what was lost here is to understand how American power once stabilized itself through land, hierarchy, and disciplined excess, and why that model no longer holds. The silence surrounding Lynhurst today is not peaceful, it is residual. Lynhurst still occupies its ground with confidence. The facade has not receded, the stonework retains its intended gravity. The approach remains deliberate, measured, and slow. From a distance, nothing signals collapse. Yet the estate no longer exerts force. It no longer organizes people, resources, or decisions. It exists, but it does not act. What defines Lynhurst today is not decay, but suspension. The buildings are maintained according to standards developed long after their authority expired. Lawns are cut on schedule. Rooflines are stabilized. Interiors are cleaned, cataloged, and lit. This maintenance suggests continuity, but it is a different form of care, reactive rather than generative. Preservation has replaced governance. The estate was once a machine calibrated for influence. Its size regulated distance. Its layout enforced hierarchy. Its rhythms structured labor and visibility. None of that operates now. Corridors lead nowhere in particular. Rooms no longer host negotiations, nor do they conceal them. The estate's spaces have lost their directional logic. They are no longer instructions. Visitors move through Lynhurst without consequence. Their presence neither interrupts nor advances anything. The estate absorbs observation without responding. This is a fundamental change. When Lynhurst functioned as power, it was not passive. It demanded alignment of staff, of schedules, of capital. Now it offers only surface. What remains visible is form, masonry, symmetry, controlled scale. What is absent is pressure. Power requires friction. It depends on resistance, obligation, risk. Lynhurst no longer carries any of these. Ownership, where it still exists, is symbolic rather than operational. Authority has been reduced to caretaking. The estate's silence is not emptiness, it is evidence of removal. Systems have been lifted out while structures remain. The financial logic that once justified continuous investment has vanished. The social contracts that sustained labor hierarchies no longer apply. What once coordinated dozens of lives now requires only a management plan. Lynhurst survives because it is no longer dangerous. Its scale no longer threatens balance. Its isolation no longer conceals leverage. What was once a site of concentration has been neutralized through irrelevance. The estate can be admired because it no longer competes. This condition produces a particular tension. The building insists on significance through its presence, while the surrounding world denies it any function. The estate stands as a solved problem, contained, understood, and stripped of leverage. Its endurance is permitted precisely because it has been rendered harmless. Nothing about this transformation required destruction. No single event removed Lynhurst from power. The estate simply failed to adapt to a world that no longer needed what it offered. Its survival is not triumph, it is accommodation. Lynhurst today is intact but unclaimed by necessity. It persists as an artifact of a system that no longer recruits such spaces. The estate remains legible but unread. It stands complete but unaddressed. Its continued existence marks not the strength of old power, but the quiet efficiency with which it was bypassed. The present condition of Lynhurst reveals a deeper truth about institutional afterlife. Power does not leave ruins behind when it departs. It leaves maintenance. What replaces authority is administration procedures without stakes, care without command. The estate's continued operation depends not on relevance, but on compliance with external standards, preservation codes, insurance frameworks, historical registries. These are systems of containment, not continuation. The estate no longer generates its own logic. Decisions affecting Lynhurst originate elsewhere, shaped by legal definitions rather than internal necessity. Repairs are approved, not required. Access is regulated, not negotiated. Even privacy has been formalized. What was once discretionary power has become conditional permission. This shift alters the meaning of every surviving feature. The gates no longer separate insiders from outsiders, they mark property boundaries. The main hall no longer establishes hierarchy, it guides circulation. Even the estate's scale has been reassigned. Where it once communicated dominance, it now communicates burden. Large rooms demand climate control. Long facades require reinforcement. Grandeur has been converted into cost. The labor that sustains Lynhurst today reflects this inversion. Staff operate as custodians of surfaces rather than participants in a system. Their work preserves appearance, not outcomes. There is no upward pressure, no expectation of discretion, no requirement to internalize the estate's authority. The building no longer disciplines those who serve it. It merely employs them. Time itself behaves differently here. When Lynhurst functioned as power, time was instrumental. Schedules synchronized activity. Delays carried meaning. Now, time is archival. The estate exists in a prolonged present, oriented towards stability rather than momentum. Nothing urgent happens here, nothing needs to. This condition produces a subtle form of erasure. Without conflict, power leaves no trace of its removal. The absence of struggle makes the transition appear natural, even inevitable. Lynhurst did not lose influence through opposition, it lost it through redundancy. The world reorganized around other mechanisms: mobile capital, distributed authority, abstracted control, leaving estates like Lynhurst structurally impressive but strategically obsolete. The estate's current neutrality allows it to be framed as heritage rather than infrastructure. Its past is curated rather than contested. Interpretive materials emphasize craftsmanship, lineage, and context, while avoiding function. The question of what Lynhurst did is replaced by what it represents. This substitution is central to its survival. Representation is safer than operation. A functioning estate concentrates resources. A preserved estate disperses responsibility. Lynhurst can exist indefinitely in this state because it no longer asks anything of the surrounding system. It demands neither loyalty nor protection. Its power has been reduced to symbolism, and symbolism rarely provokes resistance. Yet the building does not forget its original design. The proportions remain calibrated for command. The sightlines still anticipate supervision. The estate's geometry remembers a different purpose, even if the present no longer requires it. This creates a quiet dissonance between form and use, one that cannot be resolved through interpretation alone. Lynhurst's continued presence is therefore incomplete. It survives without authority, coherence, or risk. What endures is not power, but evidence of its former concentration. The estate stands not as a monument to endurance, but as proof that systems can outlive their functions without reclaiming their meaning. In this way, Lynhurst does not decline, it stabilizes. And stability, when detached from necessity, is not strength, it is stasis. Lynhurst did not emerge from excess, it emerged from requirement. In its era, power in America was not yet abstract enough to exist without anchors. Wealth needed place. Authority needed enclosure. Influence needed distance from the mechanisms it controlled. Estates like Lynhurst provided these conditions. They were not indulgences layered onto success. They were instruments that made success durable. American elite power, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, relied on a contradiction. It celebrated mobility capital, industry, expansion, while simultaneously requiring immobility at its core. Factories moved, markets shifted, railroads extended outward, but decision-making, legitimacy, and coordination required fixed ground. Lynhurst supplied that ground. The estate functioned as a stabilizing node. It absorbed volatility generated elsewhere. Financial risk taken in cities and markets was counterbalanced by land that could not move. Ownership of an estate like Lynhurst converted liquid wealth into fixed authority. It slowed time. It allowed planning across generations rather than quarters. This was not aesthetic preference. It was strategic insulation. Culturally, estates served as filters. Access was controlled. Proximity was regulated. Visibility was selective. Lynhurst allowed its owners to engage the world without being fully exposed to it. Meetings could occur without records. Relationships could develop without scrutiny. Decisions could mature before entering public systems. The estate was not separate from power. It was where power incubated. This role explains why scale mattered. Lynhurst was large not to impress, but to distance. Physical expanse reduced immediacy. Long approaches created deliberation. Multiple structures allowed separation of functions, labor, leisure, negotiation without overlap. The estate's layout enforced compartmentalization, a critical feature of elite governance. Socially, Lynhurst mattered because it naturalized hierarchy. The estate trained behavior through repetition. Staff learned roles without instruction. Guests absorbed status through spatial cues. Authority was embedded in routine rather than assertion. Over time, this produced compliance that felt voluntary. The estate made power appear orderly, even benign. Importantly, Lynhurst was not unique. It belonged to a broader system of elite estates distributed across the country. Together, these sites formed an informal network. They standardized elite culture while allowing regional variation. Shared expectations, privacy, discretion, continuity circulated through these spaces. Lynhurst was one node in a larger architecture of American dominance. The necessity of such estates becomes clearer when considering alternatives that did not yet exist. There were no corporate headquarters capable of replacing them. Legal frameworks were less robust. Public institutions lacked stability. The estate compensated for these absences. It offered continuity in a society still improvising its structures. Without Lynhurst, its owners would have been exposed to the very volatility they profited from. The estate acted as a buffer, translating economic success into social permanence. It was a site where wealth learned to behave like power. That conversion required space, routine, and removal from public immediacy. To mistake Lynhurst for ornament is to misunderstand its function. Ornament decorates what already exists. Lynhurst produced what followed. It organized relationships, disciplined capital, and anchored influence. Its cultural importance lay not in what it displayed, but in what it made possible. The estate's importance extended beyond the family that occupied it. Lynhurst participated in shaping norms that reached outward, influencing how power was recognized and trusted. In an era when American elites were still asserting legitimacy, estates provided a visual and procedural language of stability. They reassured peers, partners, and institutions that wealth had been disciplined into order. This mattered because American power lacked the inherited structures of older societies. There were no entrenched aristocracies with centuries of ritual to absorb disruption. Instead, legitimacy had to be constructed quickly and made to appear natural. Estates like Lynhurst performed this work. They offered continuity where none existed, using architecture and routine to simulate permanence. Lynhurst's cultural role was therefore instructional. It taught its occupants how to inhabit authority. Expectations were learned through environment rather than decree. Silence conveyed discretion. Distance conveyed priority. The estate trained behavior not just within its walls, but across the networks connected to it. Those who moved through Lynhurst absorbed its rules and carried them elsewhere. The estate also mattered because it concentrated trust. In a fragmented economic landscape, personal assurances still mattered. Lynhurst provided a controlled setting where reputations could be assessed and reinforced. Its isolation reduced variables. Its predictability increased confidence. Agreements reached here carried weight precisely because they were removed from public volatility. Infrastructure is defined by what it enables. Lynhurst enabled coordination across sectors that were otherwise disjointed. Industry, finance, and politics intersected here informally, without requiring institutional acknowledgement. The estate did not replace formal structures, it supplemented them. It allowed alignment before exposure. This made it indispensable. Its necessity is further revealed by the effort required to maintain it. Estates demand constant investment of resources and attention. That cost was justified only because the returns were structural. Lynhurst converted expenditure into influence. Its upkeep was not consumption, but reinforcement. The estate stabilized the identity of its owners as much as their position. Culturally, Lynhurst also served as a boundary. It separated those who could afford withdrawal from those who could not. This separation was not merely economic, it was temporal. Those within the estate operated on longer horizons. Decisions were made with an expectation of endurance. Outside, speed dominated. The estate insulated long-term thinking from short-term pressure. The presence of such spaces shaped American expectations of leadership. Authority became associated with restraint, distance, and order. Lynhurst embodied these qualities. Its very existence suggested that power should be calm, not reactive, deliberate, not exposed. This cultural imprint extended beyond the estate's lifespan. As alternatives emerged, corporate campuses, regulatory bodies, financial abstractions, the estate's role diminished. But during its period of relevance, Lynhurst was not interchangeable. It fulfilled a function no other structure could perform. It anchored power in place at a moment when place still mattered. Understanding why Lynhurst mattered requires recognizing that power once depended on physical systems. It needed rooms, walls, and land to organize itself. Lynhurst was one such system. Its cultural significance lies not in its beauty, but in its necessity. It existed because the architecture of American power once required it. Lynhurst was not conceived as a residence. It was conceived as a position. Its creation followed an internal logic shaped by the conditions of American power at the moment of its emergence. Those conditions demanded control without exposure, scale without spectacle, and permanence without reliance on public institutions. The estate's design translated these requirements into built form. The individuals who commissioned Lynhurst did not seek novelty. They sought insulation. Their wealth had been accumulated through systems that rewarded speed, leverage, and concentration. The estate existed to counterbalance those forces. It provided a site where volatility could be slowed and authority could be rehearsed away from markets and cities. The decision to build was not aspirational, it was corrective. Location was the first act of ideology. Lynhurst was placed far enough from urban centers to resist intrusion, yet close enough to remain accessible when needed. This distance was calibrated. It created separation without exile. The estate's surroundings reduced unpredictability while preserving connection. Geography here was not scenic, it was strategic. Isolation was reinforced through approach. Access routes were limited and indirect. Arrival required intention. This was not an inconvenience but a filter. Those who reached Lynhurst did so deliberately, already aligned with its rhythms. The estate began exerting influence before its walls were reached. Movement itself became a form of selection. Scale followed function. Lynhurst expanded horizontally and vertically, not to dominate the landscape, but to segment activity. Its size allowed multiple operations to occur without collision. Labor could function invisibly. Social interaction could be regulated. Decision-making could be shielded from observation. The estate's breadth was an organizational tool. Design choices reflected a preference for order over display. Architectural elements emphasized symmetry, repetition, and restraint. Ornamentation was controlled, not exuberant. Materials were chosen for endurance rather than novelty. These decisions communicated discipline. They reinforced the idea that power here was not performative. It was assumed. Internally, the estate was structured around predictability. Spaces were assigned clear purposes and rarely deviated from them. This rigidity was intentional. It reduced ambiguity and enforced routine. Those who lived and worked within Lynhurst learned its expectations through repetition. The building itself instructed behavior. The ideology embedded in Lynhurst rejected improvisation. It favored systems that could operate without constant oversight. Authority was distributed through architecture. Sightlines suggested supervision even when none was present. Boundaries defined roles without explanation. The estate functioned as a silent administrator. Importantly, Lynhurst was designed to outlast its creators. Decisions favored durability over flexibility. Alteration was possible but discouraged. The estate assumed continuity of purpose. It anticipated succession rather than disruption. This forward orientation reveals the mindset behind its creation. Power was expected to persist, not adapt. The estate's deliberate nature is evident in what it excluded. There were no unnecessary points of convergence. No spaces invited spontaneity. Everything served an organizing principle. Lynhurst did not encourage expression. It enforced alignment. Its builders understood that influence weakens when environments invite unpredictability. This logic produced a closed system. Lynhurst was meant to operate according to its own rules, insulated from external change. Its creation reflects a moment when American elites believed power could be stabilized through design alone. The estate stands as a record of that belief, encoded in stone and space. The ideology embedded in Lynhurst extended beyond architecture into governance. Ownership was conceived not as presence, but as control exercised through distance. The estate allowed its principals to withdraw without relinquishing command. This separation between physical absence and institutional authority was essential. Lynhurst enabled power to remain intact even when its holders were unseen. The estate's isolation served another purpose. It reduced dependency. Lynhurst was designed to be operationally self-contained. Water, food, labor, and maintenance could be managed internally for extended periods. This autonomy protected against external disruption. Markets could fluctuate, cities could change. The estate would continue to function. Self-sufficiency was not romantic, it was defensive. This logic shaped how labor was organized. Workers were integrated into the estate's routines rather than imported episodically. Their proximity ensured reliability, while their separation maintained hierarchy. Living quarters, service routes, and work schedules were arranged to minimize friction. Efficiency here was not about speed, it was about predictability. The system favored continuity over optimization. Financial considerations reinforced this design. Capital invested in Lynhurst was removed from circulation. This immobilization was intentional. It signaled confidence and discouraged impulsive reallocation. The estate converted liquid wealth into a fixed asset that could not easily be repurposed. This constraint disciplined ownership. It aligned resources with long-term objectives rather than short-term opportunity. The estate's planners also understood symbolism but used it sparingly. Lynhurst's visibility was controlled. It was not positioned to dominate public sightlines. Its presence was known, not broadcast. This discretion communicated a specific message. Power did not need affirmation. It expected recognition without solicitation. This restraint distinguished Lynhurst from later expressions of wealth. It avoided overt display because display invited challenge. Instead, the estate relied on coherence. Its consistency over time established credibility. Those who encountered Lynhurst recognized its authority through familiarity rather than shock. Repetition replaced spectacle. The deliberate nature of the estate is further evident in its resistance to modification. Additions were rare and conservative. The original layout remained authoritative. This rigidity limited adaptation, but preserved identity. Lynhurst was not meant to respond quickly to change. It was meant to endure it. The estate assumed that external systems would eventually conform or fail. This assumption reveals the confidence of its creators. They believed the structures of power they inhabited were stable enough to be fixed in stone. Lynhurst was an assertion that the future would resemble the present closely enough to justify permanence. The estate embodied that expectation. The location reinforced this worldview. Lynhurst occupied land that was neither marginal nor central. It avoided contested zones. Its surroundings were selected for stability, not growth. This choice limited exposure to development pressures and demographic shifts. The estate positioned itself outside cycles of rapid transformation. What emerges from these decisions is a system designed to minimize contingency. Lynhurst reduced reliance on chance by controlling environment, routine, and access. It treated uncertainty as a threat to be managed spatially. Architecture became a form of risk mitigation. In this sense, Lynhurst was not built to reflect power. It was built to preserve it. The estate translated ideology into infrastructure. It assumed that control could be maintained through design, that authority could be stabilized by limiting variables. That belief shaped every aspect of its creation, and while the world that produced it has changed, the estate remains as evidence of a moment when power trusted permanence more than adaptation. Lynhurst did not function through decree, it functioned through repetition. Power here was not asserted daily, it was maintained through routines so stable they became invisible. The estate operated as a closed system in which money, labor, and space reinforced one another without requiring constant intervention. Daily life at Lynhurst followed a disciplined rhythm. Schedules were fixed not for convenience, but for predictability. Meals, maintenance, cleaning, and movement occurred according to patterns refined over years. These routines were not rigid out of tradition, but because consistency reduced friction. When behavior became habitual, oversight became unnecessary. Labor was organized hierarchically and spatially. Staff roles were clearly defined and rarely overlapped. Each function, service, maintenance, administration, occupied its own physical and social territory. This separation limited interaction across ranks, preventing informal alliances or disruptions. Hierarchy was embedded into the estate's layout, making it self-enforcing. Movement through Lynhurst reflected this structure. Service corridors ran parallel to formal spaces, but rarely intersected them knownly. Work occurred constantly, yet remained largely unseen. This invisibility was essential. It preserved the illusion of effortless order while ensuring control over those who sustained it. The estate did not hide labor to deny its importance, but to prevent it from becoming leverage. Financial discipline was equally systematic. Expenses were planned and absorbed as part of long-term strategy rather than immediate need. Lynhurst operated on budgets designed to stabilize, not maximize. Profit was generated elsewhere. The estate consumed resources deliberately. This consumption was not wasteful, it was regulatory. Spending enforced continuity and discouraged abrupt change. Money moved through Lynhurst slowly and predictably. Large expenditures were anticipated and normalized. Smaller costs were tightly controlled. This balance created an environment where capital was present but restrained. The estate taught its owners to value endurance over expansion. Financial patience was cultivated through structure. Space functioned as a form of instruction. Large rooms imposed restraint. Long corridors discouraged haste. Private areas reinforced discretion. Public-facing spaces were formal but limited. The estate did not encourage spontaneous gathering. Interaction was intentional, scheduled, and contained. This reduced unpredictability and maintained authority. Staff learned the estate's expectations through environment rather than explanation. Silence carried meaning. Timing signaled priority. Deviation was noticeable precisely because norms were so consistent. Control was exercised indirectly. The building itself corrected behavior before confrontation was required. Importantly, Lynhurst did not depend on constant presence from its owners. Systems were designed to function autonomously. Trusted intermediaries managed daily operations. Authority flowed downward through procedure rather than personality. This allowed power to persist even during absence. The estate governed itself. The interaction between money, staff, and space produced a form of quiet command. No single element dominated. Instead, control emerged from their alignment. Labor was disciplined by architecture. Spending was shaped by routine. Space reinforced hierarchy. Together, they created stability without spectacle. This operational model treated power as something to be maintained rather than exercised. It emphasized process over action. Lynhurst did not need frequent decisions because most outcomes were predetermined by design. The estate reduced complexity by narrowing options. Such systems require constant reinforcement. Maintenance was not cosmetic, it was functional. Deferred repair was viewed as risk. Cleanliness was not aesthetic, it was symbolic of order. Attention to detail signaled authority's persistence. Neglect would have suggested vulnerability. Lynhurst's operation reveals that power, at its most durable, is procedural. It resides in habits, structures, and expectations rather than individuals. The estate did not merely house power, it performed it daily, quietly, and without interruption. This operational discipline created a specific relationship between authority and effort. At Lynhurst, power was most effective when least visible. Decisions were rarely urgent because the system was designed to absorb variation. When problems arose, they were resolved within existing routines rather than through exception. The estate discouraged improvisation not because it feared error, but because unpredictability threatened coherence. Control depended on clarity of expectation. Staff understood not only what to do, but when not to act. Initiative was constrained. Judgment was exercised within narrow parameters. This produced reliability. The estate did not reward innovation, it rewarded consistency. Over time, this shaped a workforce attuned to preservation rather than advancement. Financial restraint reinforced this culture. Even during periods of abundance, Lynhurst avoided visible excess. Consumption followed precedent. New acquisitions were rare and justified only if they aligned with established patterns. This continuity signaled stability to those within and around the estate. It suggested that authority here did not depend on constant growth. Money functioned as a binding agent rather than a display. Salaries were predictable. Contracts were long-term. The estate prioritized loyalty over efficiency. This reduced turnover and embedded institutional memory. Staff did not need to be reminded of procedures. They carried them forward. The estate's operation depended on memory as much as management. Space mediated every interaction. Encounters between ranks occurred according to protocol. Informality was contained within designated areas. This segmentation prevented the erosion of hierarchy. Familiarity did not translate into equality. The estate allowed proximity without intimacy, ensuring that relationships remained functional rather than personal. These dynamics produced a controlled social environment. Guests encountered a version of Lynhurst that was calm, orderly, and deliberate. They saw results without witnessing effort. This impression was crucial. It reinforced the perception that authority here was natural, not imposed. The estate projected inevitability. Time discipline further stabilized the system. The estate resisted urgency. Schedules allowed for delay. Decisions were made slowly and revisited cautiously. This tempo filtered out volatility. External pressures lost force when introduced into an environment that refused acceleration. Lynhurst absorbed urgency and returned it as deliberation. The absence of visible conflict was not accidental. Disputes were managed through structure rather than confrontation. Clear roles reduced friction. Limited overlap prevented competition. When tensions arose, they were contained within administrative channels. The estate avoided scenes. Order was maintained quietly. This model of operation required trust in systems over individuals. Authority did not hinge on charisma or presence. It resided in continuity. When personnel changed, routines remained. When owners were absent, procedures persisted. The estate's strength lay in its resistance to personalization. Such resistance also imposed limits. The system tolerated little deviation. Adaptation was slow. Innovation was constrained. While this ensured stability, it reduced responsiveness. Lynhurst operated optimally in a world that changed gradually. Its processes assumed continuity in external conditions. Nevertheless, during its period of relevance, this operational design was effective. It allowed power to function without constant assertion. It minimized exposure while maximizing control. The estate converted complexity into routine. What emerges from this examination is a portrait of power as maintenance. Authority was not exercised through dramatic acts, but through the steady reinforcement of norms. Lynhurst's operation reveals that dominance, at its most durable, depends on systems that make intervention unnecessary. The estate did not command daily because it had already decided in advance. Its routines were decisions made permanent. Power here was not reactive, it was prearranged. In this way, Lynhurst functioned less as a household than as an institution. Its daily operations were the mechanisms through which influence was sustained. The estate's significance lay not in what occurred there on any given day, but in how little needed to change for it to continue. At its height, Lynhurst did not appear powerful because it did not need to. Authority was assumed, embedded into the surrounding environment, reinforced by alignment rather than assertion. This was the estate's period of maximum authority, not because it expanded or intensified its operations, but because the world around it finally matched the logic it had been built to serve. During this era, Lynhurst functioned within a social and economic ecosystem that validated its design. Wealth accumulation remained concentrated. Decision-making favored discretion. Institutions were fragmented enough to require informal coordination. The estate's internal systems, its routines, hierarchies, and spatial discipline mirrored the external order. There was no friction between structure and society. Each reinforced the other. Lynhurst reached full capacity not in size, but in relevance. Every aspect of its operation had purpose. Staff numbers stabilized. Financial flows settled into predictable patterns. The estate no longer needed adjustment. It had entered equilibrium. What had once been a deliberate construction became a naturalized presence within elite life. The estate's role during this period was not visible leadership. It was quiet convergence. Lynhurst served as a point where interests aligned before emerging elsewhere as policy, investment, or influence. Its importance lay in its ability to host continuity. Relationships formed here endured because the environment discouraged volatility. Time behaved differently within the estate's boundaries, allowing long-term commitments to take root. Socially, Lynhurst became a reference point. It was not widely discussed, but it was widely understood. Those who mattered knew its rhythms and expectations. Access signaled standing, exclusion signaled limits. The estate communicated position without statement. This unspoken recognition marked its peak authority. Internally, the estate operated without strain. Systems designed decades earlier functioned smoothly because conditions had not yet outpaced them. Labor hierarchies remained intact. Financial discipline remained effective. The routines that once required enforcement had become habit. Power here had become effortless. This ease was deceptive. It masked the extent to which Lynhurst depended on external stability. Markets, though active, respected long-term capital. Social norms valued restraint and privacy. Public scrutiny remained limited. The estate's insulation worked because pressure was diffuse. Nothing yet challenged the assumption that authority should be concentrated and removed from public immediacy. During this period, Lynhurst also benefited from comparison. Emerging alternatives, corporate offices, urban institutions lacked the coherence of estates. They were functional but exposed. They operated under visibility and regulation. Lynhurst, by contrast, retained flexibility precisely because it was informal. Its authority was not codified, making it adaptable within its own boundaries. The alignment between estate and society extended to cultural expectations. Leadership was associated with calm, distance, and permanence, qualities Lynhurst embodied. The estate did not need to explain itself. Its existence was proof enough. This mutual recognition marked the height of its influence. Importantly, this era did not feel like a peak to those within it. There was no sense of culmination. The estate appeared timeless. Its system seemed sufficient. There was no urgency to reform or reconsider. Stability bred confidence, and confidence delayed questioning. Lynhurst's maximum authority was therefore quiet, unremarkable, and deeply embedded. It operated at full effectiveness because nothing yet required it to change. Structure and society were aligned, moving at compatible speeds, sharing assumptions about power's proper form. This alignment would not announce its end. It would erode gradually, almost invisibly. But during this period, Lynhurst stood precisely where it was meant to be, fully integrated, fully functional, and unquestioned. The estate's authority during this period extended beyond its boundaries without appearing to travel. Lynhurst did not project power outward, it absorbed it inward. Decisions influenced by its environment emerged elsewhere, bearing institutional legitimacy, detached from their origins. This diffusion was essential. Influence that could not be traced, could not be contested. Lynhurst's effectiveness relied on its compatibility with prevailing economic rhythms. Capital still respected duration. Ownership implied responsibility rather than liquidity. The estate's immobilized wealth signaled commitment, reassuring partners and peers that decisions formed here were not provisional. This alignment allowed Lynhurst to operate as a stabilizing reference point in an economy that still valued continuity. Social systems reinforced this function. Elite networks were dense but discreet. Trust circulated through familiarity rather than transparency. Lynhurst provided a setting where reputations could be maintained without exposure. The estate's isolation reduced the risk of misinterpretation. Its predictability reinforced credibility. Nothing unexpected happened here, and that was its strength. The estate's physical presence during this era carried weight precisely because it remained unchanged. Continuity signaled reliability. Guests encountered the same routines, the same spaces, the same expectations year after year. This repetition built confidence. It suggested that authority here was not reactive, but settled. Lynhurst also benefited from generational overlap. Those who had participated in its creation remained present alongside successors trained within its system. This continuity of experience minimized disruption. Knowledge passed informally, embedded in habit rather than instruction. The estate functioned as a training ground for endurance rather than innovation. Externally, Lynhurst's influence was magnified by scarcity. Few estates operated with comparable coherence. As alternatives multiplied, financial instruments, legal frameworks, administrative bodies, they had not yet achieved trust. Lynhurst filled that gap. It provided a space where informal authority could operate efficiently while formal systems matured. The estate's role during this period was therefore transitional, though it did not perceive itself as such. It bridged an era when power required place and an emerging era when power would detach from it. At its peak, Lynhurst balanced both worlds. It retained physical authority while engaging with increasingly abstract systems. This balance depended on restraint. Lynhurst avoided expansion that would attract attention. It resisted modification that would suggest instability. Its strength lay in remaining legible to those who mattered and invisible to those who did not. Authority thrived in this narrow band. The estate's maximum authority was sustained by shared assumptions. Power was expected to be discreet. Wealth was expected to be stewarded. Influence was expected to persist. Lynhurst embodied these beliefs so thoroughly that they went unquestioned. The estate did not impose order, it reflected it. Yet this reflection carried risk. Because Lynhurst mirrored its society so closely, it became vulnerable to shifts it could not control. Its systems were optimized for alignment, not resistance. When external conditions began to diverge, the estate would struggle to adjust. During its era of maximum authority, however, this vulnerability remained latent. The estate appeared complete. Its processes were synchronized with the world around it. Power flowed through Lynhurst without obstruction, unremarked and unchallenged. This period stands as the estate's moment of fullest integration, a time when structure, culture, and economy moved together. Lynhurst did not dominate its environment, it fit it perfectly. The first signs of strain at Lynhurst did not arrive as crisis. They arrived as adjustment. Nothing broke, nothing failed. The estate continued to function, but with a growing sense that its systems were working harder to produce the same results. Pressure entered quietly, not through confrontation, but through context. External conditions began to shift in ways Lynhurst could not influence. Wealth changed its character. Capital became more mobile, more abstracted from land and long-term stewardship. Returns accelerated. Time horizons shortened. The estate's logic, built on patience, immobilization, and continuity, remained intact, but it was no longer mirrored by the wider economy. Legal frameworks expanded their reach. Regulation increased. Informal arrangements that once relied on discretion became less reliable. Authority that had operated through trust now required documentation. Lynhurst's strength had been its ability to function between institutions, supplementing them quietly. As formal systems matured, that space narrowed. Public legitimacy also evolved. Distance, once associated with authority, began to read as detachment. Privacy, previously respected, became suspect. Expectations shifted toward visibility and accountability. Lynhurst did not adapt its posture. It continued to value insulation. This choice did not yet provoke resistance, but it reduced alignment. These changes introduced friction without disruption. The estate still hosted gatherings. It still coordinated relationships, but outcomes required more effort. Negotiations took longer. Assurances carried less automatic weight. Lynhurst's environment, designed to slow time, now risked appearing unresponsive rather than deliberate. Internally, routines remained unchanged. Staff hierarchies held. Financial discipline persisted, yet the external rewards for such stability diminished. The estate's costs became more visible. Maintenance that once signaled permanence now appeared as overhead. Expenditure required justification beyond tradition. The estate responded not by reform, but by preservation. It tightened adherence to existing systems. Deviations were discouraged. Continuity was treated as protection. This response was rational, given Lynhurst's design. The estate had been built to endure gradual change, not sudden rupture. Reinforcement seemed prudent. However, reinforcement revealed dependence. The estate's authority required conditions it could not reproduce alone. Its effectiveness had always relied on external recognition, unspoken but essential. As that recognition softened, Lynhurst's influence became more conditional. These pressures did not produce visible decline. The estate remained stable. It did not lose staff. It did not fragment, but its role subtly narrowed. Where it once initiated alignment, it now maintained relationships already formed elsewhere. Lynhurst shifted from origin point to support structure. Importantly, this transition was not acknowledged within the estate. There was no internal language for partial relevance. Power was understood as either present or absent. As long as systems functioned, authority was assumed. The estate's design left little room to perceive gradual misalignment. The surrounding world, however, was changing pace. New centers of coordination emerged. Less spatial, more procedural. Authority increasingly flowed through offices, boards, and frameworks that did not require isolation or scale. Lynhurst's advantages became situational rather than structural. Still, collapse did not follow. The estate absorbed pressure through continuity. Its systems, though less efficient, remained effective enough. Stability delayed reckoning. Lynhurst continued to operate as it always had, believing endurance itself would restore alignment. This phase marked a critical transition. The estate had not yet declined, but it was no longer unquestioned. Pressure existed without consequence, stress without failure. Lynhurst entered a period where its survival seemed assured, even as its necessity quietly diminished. This period of strain altered the estate's relationship to decision-making. Lynhurst began to react where it had once anticipated. Adjustments were subtle. Changes in scheduling, increased consultation, longer intervals between commitments, but they signaled a shift in posture. The estate was no longer setting tempo. It was accommodating it. Money, in particular, behaved differently under pressure. While resources remained ample, their symbolic weight changed. Expenditure no longer conveyed inevitability. It suggested choice. The estate's long-standing practice of absorbing cost as a signal of stability now invited scrutiny. Financial discipline persisted, but its meaning inverted. What once demonstrated strength now required explanation. Ownership, too, experienced recalibration. Authority that had once flowed naturally from possession now encountered external constraints. Legal compliance introduced oversight. Transparency standards narrowed discretion. Lynhurst's autonomy was not removed, but it was bounded. The estate remained private, yet increasingly legible to systems beyond its control. Staff sensed these shifts indirectly. Procedures grew more formal. Documentation increased. Informal problem-solving gave way to administrative review. These changes did not disrupt hierarchy, but they altered its texture. Authority became procedural rather than assumed. This subtle transition marked the beginning of institutionalization, a process that would later accelerate. The estate's spatial logic remained unchanged, but its interpretive context evolved. Isolation, once protective, now risked inefficiency. Distance delayed response. The estate's refusal to accelerate began to feel less deliberate and more resistant. Lynhurst had been built to withstand volatility, not to navigate acceleration. Externally, networks that once relied on estates like Lynhurst developed alternatives. Communication technologies reduced the need for physical convergence. Legal structures offered predictability without discretion. Trust migrated from personal environments to institutional guarantees. Lynhurst remained relevant, but less central. Importantly, these developments did not register as threat. They were framed as modernization elsewhere, not erosion here. The estate interpreted continuity as validation. Its unchanged routines became proof of resilience. This reinforced confidence, even as alignment weakened. The estate's response to pressure was conservative by design. It privileged stability over experimentation. This preserved coherence, but limited adaptation. Lynhurst maintained its internal order at the expense of external integration. It continued to function effectively within its own logic, while the surrounding system recalibrated. This phase produced a narrowing of influence. Lynhurst no longer initiated frameworks. It participated in them. Its role shifted from organizer to anchor. It stabilized existing relationships rather than forming new ones. Authority persisted, but its scope contracted, yet this contraction remained invisible from within. The estate's metrics for success had not changed. Systems still operated. Hierarchies remained intact. Costs were manageable. There was no internal signal demanding transformation. Lynhurst did not perceive itself as under threat because it had not yet failed. Pressure without collapse is a deceptive condition. It rewards continuity while undermining relevance. Lynhurst endured precisely because it resisted change. Its survival postponed recognition of misalignment. The estate remained structurally sound, socially intact, and operationally disciplined. This endurance, however, depended on the assumption that external systems would stabilize around it once more. Lynhurst trusted that cycles would turn, that volatility would recede, and that its model would regain prominence. The estate had weathered shifts before. It expected to do so again. In this way, pressure became normalized. Misalignment was absorbed into routine. Lynhurst continued forward without interruption, confident in its capacity to outlast fluctuation. The estate had not yet entered decline. It had entered latency, a period where function persisted, but necessity quietly receded. The transition at Lynhurst did not begin with loss. It began with substitution, stewardship. The patient, ideological commitment that once governed every decision was gradually replaced by preservation. This change was subtle but decisive. The estate was no longer treated as a system to be sustained, but as an asset to be maintained. Ownership did not disappear, it persisted in form and legality. What receded was conviction. Lynhurst had once demanded belief in permanence, in hierarchy, in the necessity of insulation. As external systems assumed functions the estate once performed, that belief weakened. Ownership remained, but its purpose narrowed. Decisions increasingly focused on retention rather than direction. The question shifted from how the estate should function to how it should survive. Long-term control gave way to short-term continuity. The goal was no longer to shape outcomes, but to avoid disruption. This reframing altered every calculation. Financial behavior reflected this change. Investment favored visible upkeep over systemic renewal. Roofs were repaired, facades preserved, interiors stabilized. These actions protected appearance, but they did not reinforce function. Money flowed toward conservation rather than coordination. The estate's role as an organizing center diminished as resources were redirected toward surface integrity. This shift marked the beginning of hollowing. Lynhurst still operated, but its operations were no longer generative. Staff maintained routines inherited from an earlier era, but those routines no longer produced influence. Labor preserved form without advancing purpose. The estate became efficient at sustaining itself, not at exercising authority. Ownership's relationship to the estate also changed. Where once Lynhurst disciplined its owners, binding them to long horizons and inherited responsibility, it now adapted to their constraints. Flexibility replaced obligation. Absence increased. Decisions were deferred or delegated. The estate no longer shaped its holders, it accommodated them. This accommodation eroded ideology. Without active commitment, Lynhurst's systems persisted mechanically. Procedures continued because they existed, not because they mattered. Hierarchies remained, but their rationale weakened. Authority was preserved ceremonially rather than operationally. Importantly, this was not perceived as decline. Preservation created an illusion of care. The estate looked stable. Its condition appeared secure. In many respects, it was better maintained than before. But maintenance without mission alters meaning. Lynhurst was being protected from change, not prepared for relevance. Extraction occurred quietly. Cultural value replaced strategic value. The estate began to generate returns through representation rather than coordination. Its significance was harvested symbolically through recognition, heritage, and legacy, rather than exercised materially. Power was no longer practiced, it was remembered. This process did not require conflict. There was no confrontation between past and present. The estate adapted by reducing ambition. It accepted a smaller role. Stewardship, which once implied responsibility for shaping outcomes beyond the estate, was replaced by caretaking limited to its boundaries. The hollowing of Lynhurst was therefore internal. Walls remained, staff remained, ownership remained. What withdrew was necessity. The estate continued to exist as an object of management rather than a site of authority. Its systems ran, but they no longer mattered to anything beyond themselves. This stage marked a profound transformation. Lynhurst had not fallen, it had been redefined. Its survival no longer depended on influence but on acceptability. The estate began to function within limits imposed by external systems rather than asserting its own logic. The transition from stewardship to extraction set the conditions for everything that followed. Lynhurst remained intact, but its center of gravity shifted. What was once an engine of power became a vessel of preservation. As stewardship receded, the estate's internal logic adjusted to a narrower horizon. Decisions were evaluated for risk avoidance rather than consequence. What mattered was not how Lynhurst shaped the future, but how it avoided becoming a problem in the present. This recalibration transformed governance into risk management. Ownership increasingly viewed the estate through external lenses. Legal compliance, public perception, and financial efficiency replaced ideological coherence. Lynhurst was assessed according to criteria developed outside its original system. Its success was measured by stability, not influence. This externalization of standards marked a critical loss of autonomy. Labor felt this shift in purpose. Roles that once supported a broader institutional function were reduced to maintenance tasks. Expertise gave way to protocol. Institutional memory remained, but it was no longer activated. Staff preserved processes whose original reasons had faded. Work continued, but its meaning thinned. Space itself responded to this change. Rooms designed for discretion and negotiation became underutilized. They were preserved as symbols rather than used as instruments. Movement through the estate slowed further, not from deliberation, but from absence. Lynhurst became quieter, not because order had deepened, but because demand had receded. Financial extraction did not occur through liquidation, it occurred through conversion. The estate's value was translated into cultural capital. Recognition replaced authority. Lynhurst was framed as legacy rather than leverage. This reframing allowed it to remain protected, but it stripped it of agency. Preservation policies reinforced this condition. By fixing the estate in a particular historical moment, they stabilized form while freezing function. Adaptation became constrained. Change required justification. Innovation risked erasure of heritage. Lynhurst was preserved into irrelevance. This preservation also altered time. The estate ceased to operate toward future outcomes. Its orientation shifted backward. Decisions referenced precedent rather than projection. The future was managed as a threat to continuity rather than a field of possibility. This temporal contraction further hollowed its purpose. Importantly, the estate's hollowing did not provoke resistance. There was no constituency demanding restoration of authority. External systems had absorbed its former functions. Lynhurst's withdrawal was accommodated without disruption. Its reduced role fit neatly into the surrounding order. The estate's survival thus became conditional on restraint. It endured by limiting ambition. Its presence was tolerated because it no longer asserted itself. Lynhurst became an object to be managed rather than a force to be negotiated with. This transformation was decisive. Extraction replaced stewardship because stewardship no longer produced returns. The long-term commitments Lynhurst once embodied lost relevance in a system that valued flexibility and speed. Preservation offered a compromise. The estate could remain, provided it did not interfere. By the end of this phase, Lynhurst had completed its internal retreat. It still appeared whole. Its systems still functioned. But the estate no longer organized anything beyond its own maintenance. Power had not left abruptly. It had been carefully removed, one justification at a time. What remained was a structure optimized for survival rather than authority. Lynhurst had become resilient without being consequential. The estate stood intact, but its role had been reduced to memory management. This hollowing was irreversible, not because it destroyed Lynhurst, but because it resolved it. The estate no longer needed to decide what it was for. That question had been answered elsewhere. Lynhurst survives because it no longer intervenes. Its continued existence depends on withdrawal rather than assertion. The estate transitions fully into management during this phase, governed not by internal logic, but by external frameworks designed to prevent loss rather than enable purpose. Survival becomes procedural. Heritage replaces authority as the estate's primary justification. Lynhurst is now valued for what it represents, not what it does. Its legitimacy rests on recognition rather than necessity. This shift alters the estate's relationship to time. The present no longer matters except as a means of preservation. The future is framed as risk. Management structures assume control where ownership once governed. Decisions are guided by policy, compliance, and documentation. Responsibility is distributed across committees, caretakers, and institutions whose mandates emphasize protection. Lynhurst is no longer directed, it is supervised. The estate's autonomy contracts into oversight. What is saved in this process is form. Walls, roofs, proportions, and materials are stabilized. Original layouts are maintained. Surface continuity is prioritized. The estate becomes legible as history. Its physical coherence is preserved with precision. This work is careful and exhaustive. What cannot be preserved is function. The estate's original purpose depended on conditions that cannot be restored. Discretion cannot be archived. Authority cannot be exhibited. The routines that once produced influence lose meaning when separated from consequence. They can be reenacted, but not revived. This distinction shapes every choice. Rooms are conserved, but not activated. Pathways are maintained, but no longer direct anything. Spaces designed for negotiation are interpreted rather than used. The estate's internal hierarchy remains visible but inert. Preservation secures appearance, not operation. Labor reflects this transformation. Staff become custodians of authenticity rather than participants in a system. Their task is accuracy, not discretion. They ensure continuity of surface detail, not continuity of power. Institutional memory is documented but no longer enacted. Knowledge is stored rather than practiced. Money also changes role. Funding supports stabilization, restoration, and compliance. It does not circulate to generate leverage. Financial flows are justified through preservation outcomes rather than strategic advantage. Cost is evaluated against risk of loss, not potential gain. Investment becomes defensive. Lynhurst's isolation, once essential, now serves containment. It limits exposure. It protects surfaces from intrusion. Distance preserves condition rather than authority. The estate's boundaries no longer filter access for alignment. They restrict it for conservation. This produces a specific kind of endurance. Lynhurst persists without consequence. Its survival is ensured precisely because it no longer matters operationally. The estate is allowed to remain because it no longer competes with contemporary systems. Its presence is neutral. Endurance without relevance is stable but static. The estate exists within a protected category that removes it from pressure. Change becomes exceptional rather than expected. Lynhurst is conserved against time, but also against use. This phase clarifies a fundamental difference. Survival protects what exists. Relevance requires interaction. Lynhurst secures the former by surrendering the latter. The estate's systems continue only insofar as they do not assert themselves. The transition into heritage completes the estate's retreat from power. Lynhurst remains visible, maintained, and acknowledged. Yet its relationship to the world has shifted decisively. It no longer organizes. It no longer disciplines. It no longer absorbs pressure. The estate survives as a managed artifact. What endures is structure. What disappears is agency. This managed survival reshapes the estate's meaning. Lynhurst becomes legible as a completed narrative rather than a living system. Interpretation replaces participation. The estate is framed through explanation rather than experience. Its significance is mediated, not enacted. Heritage structures impose limits that earlier systems did not recognize. Change requires justification, anchored in preservation doctrine. Adaptation risks dilution of authenticity. Lynhurst's ability to respond to present conditions narrows further. Stability becomes the highest value. The estate is protected from erosion, but also from evolution. What endures most clearly is material order. The estate's proportions remain authoritative in appearance, even as their purpose dissolves. Visitors encounter a coherence that suggests intention, but the intention no longer operates. This disjunction creates a particular stillness. The building appears ready, yet nothing is expected of it. Certain elements resist preservation entirely. The informal negotiations, unrecorded exchanges, and implicit hierarchies that once defined Lynhurst cannot be stabilized. They depended on exclusivity, risk, and discretion conditions, incompatible with heritage frameworks. Once removed, they cannot be restored without undermining the estate's protected status. The estate's relationship to labor further illustrates this loss. Where once staff internalized authority, they now externalize care. Their work maintains surfaces, not systems. Knowledge is procedural, not situational. The estate no longer trains behavior, it instructs technique. Time behaves differently as well. Lynhurst exists in an extended present oriented toward maintenance cycles rather than generational continuity. Long horizons have collapsed into repeating intervals of inspection, repair, and review. The future is not anticipated, it is managed. This shift redefines endurance as repetition rather than progression. Financial logic follows suit. Resources are allocated to prevent deterioration, not to produce alignment. Expenditure defends against loss rather than enabling leverage. This inversion ensures survival while eliminating purpose. Lynhurst becomes expensive to keep and impossible to use as intended. The estate's neutrality is now complete. It no longer exerts pressure on surrounding systems. Its existence does not shape behavior beyond its boundaries. It is accommodated because it is inert. Lynhurst occupies space without demanding accommodation. This condition clarifies the difference between endurance and relevance. Endurance preserves form across time. Relevance requires ongoing interaction with changing systems. Lynhurst achieves the former by relinquishing the latter. Its survival depends on withdrawal from consequence. The estate's presence remains instructive, though indirectly. It demonstrates how systems outlive their functions when preserved without purpose. Lynhurst stands as evidence that stability can mask obsolescence. Its continued maintenance suggests importance, even as its operational meaning disappears. What cannot be preserved is the estate's former capacity to shape outcomes. Influence, once dispersed quietly through its spaces, has migrated to structures less visible and more abstract. Lynhurst remains because it no longer competes with those structures. Its endurance is permitted precisely because it is resolved. By the end of this phase, Lynhurst has completed its transformation. It is no longer a participant in power. It is a reference point. The estate survives not by adapting, but by being contained. What remains is not authority, but continuity without demand. Lynhurst persists as a stable artifact within a system that no longer requires it to act. Lynhurst no longer represents power as it once understood itself. It represents aftermath. The estate stands as a resolved structure within an unresolved question. What becomes of institutions built for permanence when permanence itself loses authority? This is not a question Lynhurst answers directly. It is one the estate holds in suspension. The building's present meaning is not derived from use, but from survival. Lynhurst demonstrates that elite systems do not always collapse when they lose relevance. They persist, often intact, carrying forward the physical evidence of a logic that no longer governs. This persistence complicates narratives of decline. Nothing here appears ruined, yet nothing here operates. In this way, Lynhurst reframes the idea of institutional death. Power does not always exit dramatically. Sometimes it evacuates quietly, leaving structure behind. What remains is not a failure, but a remainder. The estate becomes a container for absence, visible, maintained, and stripped of consequence. What Lynhurst teaches about elite permanence is therefore cautionary. Permanence once depended on alignment between ideology, environment, and infrastructure. When those elements moved together, authority felt natural and unassailable. Lynhurst embodied that alignment at its height. Its survival today reveals what happens when that alignment dissolves without confrontation. The estate now functions as a reference rather than a force. It illustrates how thoroughly power once depended on physical systems, on distance, enclosure, and repetition, and how completely it has migrated elsewhere. Modern power no longer requires such anchors. It operates through abstraction, mobility, and procedural reach. Lynhurst remains because it is no longer necessary. This transition exposes a limit. Elite permanence was never guaranteed by wealth alone. It required environments capable of stabilizing uncertainty. When uncertainty changed, form becoming faster, more diffuse, less spatial, the old architectures could not adapt. Lynhurst did not fail to survive. It failed to translate itself forward. The estate's continued presence risks misinterpretation. Stability can be mistaken for relevance. Preservation can be confused with importance. Lynhurst challenges that assumption. It endures without shaping outcomes. Its influence has been replaced by systems that leave fewer traces and demand less space. Yet the estate is not meaningless. It offers evidence. It demonstrates that power once believed itself to be architectural, that authority could be built, maintained, and inherited through place. Lynhurst stands as proof of that belief, even as it disproves its permanence. The unresolved question Lynhurst raises is not about restoration. The estate cannot return to function without violating the conditions that allow it to remain. The question is whether modern power has any equivalent architecture at all, any structure capable of absorbing time, disciplining behavior, and surviving shifts without becoming inert. Lynhurst does not provide an answer. It provides contrast. Its mass, order, and restraint highlight how power once materialized itself. Its stillness underscores how power now avoids such commitments. The estate stands complete, but incomplete in meaning. It persists as a reminder that institutions can outlast their purposes while losing their authority. Lynhurst remains, not as a model to recover, but as a boundary marker showing where one conception of elite permanence ended. The afterlife of Lynhurst reveals a broader pattern shared by many elite institutions. When power no longer needs the structures that once sustained it, those structures do not vanish. They are reclassified. Lynhurst has been reassigned from necessity to heritage, from instrument to illustration. This reassignment is not failure, it is resolution. The estate now operates as a fixed reference point against a moving landscape. Its continued existence offers contrast rather than continuity. Lynhurst shows how authority once anchored itself physically, accepting constraint in exchange for endurance. Modern systems reject that trade. They prefer flexibility over permanence, reach over enclosure. Lynhurst remains because it embodies a choice no longer made. This reframing alters how elite permanence is understood. Stability alone is insufficient. Without interaction, permanence becomes inertia. Lynhurst survives because it has been relieved of demand. It is protected precisely because it does not participate. The estate's preservation confirms its obsolescence. What the building retains is coherence. Its design still communicates order, hierarchy, and restraint. These qualities remain legible, even if their function has evaporated. Lynhurst demonstrates that form can outlive purpose, but cannot replace it. Architecture remembers even when systems forget. The estate also exposes a vulnerability in institutional ambition. Systems built for endurance assume continuity in external conditions. When that assumption fails, durability becomes rigidity. Lynhurst's inability to adapt does not diminish its past effectiveness, but it defines its present irrelevance. The estate was designed to outlast individuals, not paradigms. This distinction matters. Elite power once trusted that its organizing principles would remain stable across generations. Lynhurst was built on that trust. Its survival without function shows the limits of that expectation. Permanence required alignment, not just wealth or scale. When alignment disappeared, endurance alone was insufficient. Lynhurst now stands outside the cycle of influence. It neither accumulates nor distributes power. It is observed rather than engaged. This neutrality allows it to persist without conflict. The estate has been absorbed into a system that values it as evidence, not as participant. The unresolved question Lynhurst leaves behind concerns architecture itself. If power no longer commits to place, what replaces the stabilizing role estates once played? Modern authority operates without visible anchors, but it remains vulnerable to volatility of its own kind. Lynhurst suggests that every system eventually confronts the limits of its preferred form. The estate does not argue for return. It does not advocate restoration. It exists as a completed chapter. Its presence marks the end of a particular architectural logic of power, one that believed permanence could be built and maintained through structure alone. Lynhurst endures quietly, contained and coherent. It offers no instruction for the future, only a record of a past confidence in material order. The estate remains because it has nothing left to prove. In this sense, Lynhurst is neither caution nor consolation. It is documentation, a physical account of how power once organized itself and how completely that organization has been outpaced. What survives here is not authority, but clarity. The estate stands as an answer to a question no longer asked.